You got to put on your Jewish caps today, if you will. I guess they have one, don't they? But you got to put on your Orthodox Jewish cap, and we're going to kind of get into the sermon a little bit. Because one of the things that you're really going to have to understand about the Orthodox Jews and the Pharisees and scribes that Jesus was up against is that cleanliness, man, that was like the top dog of all the rules. You just didn't break that. Their whole society centered around who was clean and who wasn't clean, and who got to determine who was clean and who wasn't clean. And if you're unclean, you're removed from the church. You're put off in timeout. And if you're in timeout, it was the priest were the ones that could reinstate you back in the community of faith. And this could take a lifetime. It could take generations. It could take a week, depending on how much money I had, imagine. It's kind of how everything works. And so they're very compulsive about their cleanliness. And it had nothing to do whatsoever about hygiene, but everything to do with the part of the ceremony that the traditions of the elders came up with. They had this brilliant idea once upon a time. And one thing we also have to know about being unclean is that being unclean was also transferable. You know what that means, right? It was contagious. If you happened to bump into somebody who was unclean or run into an animal that was unclean, that made you, all right, we're catching on, aren't we? Okay? Even that, as it got even more extensive, if you were walking down a dirt road and a herd of swines, these unclean animals, come flying out in front of you, kicking up dust, they didn't touch you, but their dust did. That made you what? Unclean, okay? Cleanliness was everything to them. And they believed as long as you were clean and kept unclean, this is what made God so incredibly happy. And so all of the laws set up around who was clean, who wasn't clean, not all the laws, but many of the laws, and all the dietary things of what you can eat, what you cannot eat, and when you choose to eat, how can you eat so all that dust from all those Gentiles doesn't get into your system and make you an ugly, mean, unclean person. Cleanliness was a matter of life and death, literally. To the point that it was just as wrong to eat pork at the men's breakfast as it was to break into a neighbor's house and steal everything and rob them blind. Just as much a sin. What does that tell us? It tells us our men need some repenting. That's what that tells us. So, part of the law, the extended laws as we have it up here, begin to tell the process how it is that we can become clean. And it used to be as simple as in the morning as the sun rises, what you would do is you would wash your hands and you would greet the new day and greet God with cleanliness. But as the traditions continued to grow and develop, that became a problem. It wasn't good enough. And so they had to expand on that as the generations went by. And so by the time Jesus arrives on the scene, taking cleanliness through the tradition of the elders, it reached a whole new level. And so you are now a Jew. Before every meal, this is what the tradition of the elders tell us. You ready for this? Water jars were kept ready to use before each meal. The minimum amount of water to be used was 1/4 of a log. How big is that? Well, it was enough to fill 1.5 eggshells. Okay, so you get a minute how much water at the least you can use. The water was first poured on both hands, held with the fingers pointed upward. You would take the water and you would put it on your hands and allow it to drip just before it hits the wrist. And you can't touch that water. Why? The water is unclean. If it touches anything, then you have to start the whole process over again. And the second thing you do after that is you turn the hand over and then you pour water on the hand once again. In this way, the water then drips off onto the ground, and then you would take your fist and you would smash it into your hands like this, and then you were clean. And God is so happy. This is the tradition that the Orthodox Jew believed God wanted everyone to do. And when they noticed that the disciples of the Jewish teacher did not observe those particular laws, well, they traveled 90 miles to see what was going on and how can you justify not doing these things. And he asked the question, why is it that your disciples do not observe the laws of washing their hands with our traditions that our traditions lay down? Now, what would our response be if that question were us? Why do you not wash your hands that way? What would we say? Because it is stupid. Right? You really think God's going, yeah, did you see the way he did that? Fist? Yeah. Right on. Because it's stupid. Now, those weren't Jesus' words. At least I don't think they were. I didn't look at the translation very well. But we know that, God doesn't really care, or cares less, I guess, about the state of our hands and what goes into our mouths. And cares more about the state of what? Of our hearts, our minds, our consciousness. What makes us holy is not how clean our hands might be or might not be, but how we approach God with an open mind, how we approach God with an open heart, so that we can respond to God to others who are in need, who have been disenfranchised. We see these traditions. Let me rephrase that. I may be speaking for you. I see these traditions as stupid. But we see them, I think, as stupid more because they're not our traditions, right? We're not emotionally attached to those sort of things. We're not connected to those traditions at all. And it's easy for us to be objective with other people's traditions. However, you can throw objectivity out the window when we start talking about our traditions, right? Because our traditions, they're the true way. It is how God wants us to be, and it's how God expects us to do things around here. Because our traditions, they touch our hearts. They cause us to cry or to cringe. They cause us to bend down our knees and be called sacred. They have a sacred place within us. And we dare not cross those lines of those traditions because they're ours. I remember I was serving church at River Oaks before I came here. And we had this group of young people, really energetic people, in their early 20s. And there's about 5 or 6 of them that are really fired up to do some things. And so they want to do some pretty neat stuff through the church and the community. And so what we did is that we went to the elders, and we talked a little bit about, hey, got this group of people, they're real fired up, they want to make some changes, they want to do some things, build some neat ministry. But the problem is that they don't know how to get started and what to do. And so the response to that was, well, it's pretty simple. They need to join a committee on the church committee. And then once they're on the committee, then they can serve on that committee for a year, and then maybe get the committee to do some things. And then if they're on it long enough, they would be able to be chair of that committee. And once they're chair of that committee, then they can be a part of the larger board. And if you get enough on the larger board, then what can happen is then they can really start making some changes to make it easier for people to do ministry. And I said, they'll be old people by then. I'll be doing their funerals by then. But to break outside of what they saw as how you were supposed to do things in the life of the church was sacred. Instead of, I just told the kids, don't tell anybody. If God places this in your heart, let's get together and let's go do it. And that's exactly what we did, and that's just how things were. But it was hard to break out of that mode. In the 1800s, this instrument was being introduced into the church. And man, did it cause some stir, you know it? It causes churches to split because these people were bringing this instrument into the church and introducing these new hymns and music, and it was nothing but entertainment. But a group of people stood up and said, you know what? The people in the bars and in all these other places, they really enjoy this instrument. And so we want to introduce it into worship. And maybe it would draw people who are not connecting with God. Maybe it'll help them connect with God. You know what that instrument was? It was the organ. It was the crazy instrument back in the day, right? And so you look about where we are today, how many organ recitals do we hear on, KISS FM? What people are listening to. But to say that we're going to not use it as much or replace it with something like a piano or a guitar or drums, it's the same argument they used over 100 years ago. Are you kidding me? That's what they use in them bars. That's what all those people want to come in. And they want to just be entertained. Those traditions are hard to break because our denomination started as being cutting edge. We're going to do everything we can in our ability to reach out to people who are unchurched and connect with them so they can connect with God. But as we use and do things the same way, it's all of a sudden become closed. We can't do that anymore because our traditions are more important than reaching out to people. It's a constant renewal of what we try to do to relay the message of Christ to people who don't hear it. Sometimes we're more worried about what we do in worship. What is pleasing for me? What brings comfort to me? What is my order for me to be able to worship? Instead of trying to find ways of which our hearts and our minds can be shaped into the image of God in order to be instruments of God in the world in which we live. How can we better serve God in the world that comes together through this act that we call worship? It's what Jesus was dealing with in our story. It's what we deal with every day in the life of the church. And if we're not careful, Jesus might say the same thing he said to them when he quoted Isaiah. These people, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts, they're so far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. That's what theologian Thomas Aquinas once said. Humans, we see the deed, but God sees the intention behind that deed. Jesus debated that what pleases God is not keeping up with our traditions, but how we treat others, and not just those next to us, but those outside these walls, how we treat others with respect, and how do we respond to others in need? How much do we understand the needs of those that God calls us to serve? And how well do we respect those we do not even know when it comes to our worship? Many years ago, I went to do a seminar at a church down in Waco. And I set up my room, and they were going to all meet together and worship. And as the worship began, I was still setting up, so I come to join the worship. And I opened up those doors. And I looked in, and I just thought for a moment, what is this? Everybody was standing up. The organ was playing a hymn. Everyone had their hymnals. And the choir was walking forward in a procession. Everybody had their robes and moving forward. And that was something that I remember seeing as a young child in the 60s and 70s. But as I saw that, my first thought was, what if I've never walked into this church before? And I walked into this worship and saw this scene. what would be going through my mind? It looks more like a cultic worship than something that I would be able to identify with. How we worship and what we worship has changed for generations and generations and generations. How we teach it and what we do in it is just as important as understanding why we do what we do and finding out what it is that people need in order to find that significant relationship with God that we have found. I want you to reflect on why it is that we worship.